quorum being present, the Committee on Education and the Workforce will come to order. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's hearing. The committee is honored to welcome our distinguished guests, Secretary Alexander Acosta. Secretary Acosta has been at the helm of the Department of Labor since April, and we're grateful he could join us to testify for the first time since his confirmation. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the committee. We look forward to your testimony, which we are sorry did not arrive earlier, and discussing the Department of Labor's policies and priorities under the new administration. The Department of Labor is on the front line of the issues facing workers and job creators, and it sets policies that have a widespread impact on our nation's economy, employment growth, retirement security, and more. Whether they relate to health care, worker protections, retirement planning, workforce development, or employee wages and benefits, it's the responsibility of this committee to ensure these policies are in the best interest of workers, employers, and taxpayers. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. No matter what party controls the administration, this committee is dedicated to robust oversight. We take our oversight responsibilities very seriously. Today's hearing is the latest step in our effort to hold federal government officials accountable. The American people are counting on that accountability, especially at a time when the economy is still improving. We're all encouraged by the economic growth we've seen this year. In the third quarter of 2017, real GDP increased at an annual rate of 3%. That is a remarkable improvement considering it's twice as much as the mere 1.5% growth rate we saw during the final year of the Obama administration. It's also great to see more and more Americans getting back to work. Nearly 1.5 million jobs have been added since February. Meaningful progress has been made, but there's no question we have more work to do after 8 years of lost opportunity. However, even though the unemployment rate is down, we still have 6.5 million workers out of work, including 1.6 million on a long-term basis. 4.8 million workers are working part-time because their hours have been cut back or because they were unable to find a full-time job. At the same time, we have 6.1 million jobs unfilled, due in part to our nation's skills gap. Expanding pathways to career success is a critical component to closing this gap and helping more Americans find good-paying jobs. That's why Congress and the administration have made workforce development and skills-based education a leading priority. This happens to be National Apprenticeship Week, and so we're eager to hear from you, Mr. Secretary, on the steps the department plans to take to promote apprenticeships and other skills-based education programs. This is something our committee has been focused on for quite some time now. It's encouraging to have a partner in the White House and the Department of Labor. We look forward to further discussion of how we can work together to expand educational opportunities and empower more Americans to realize their God-given potential. In addition, I hope you'll be able to provide the committee members and the public with your views about the department's efforts to advance economic opportunities for workers by strengthening workplace democracy, ensuring safe and healthy workplaces, enhancing retirement security, and providing workers and employers with more affordable health care options. We're also very interested in hearing more about the department's regulatory and enforcement agenda. This committee spent the early part of this year advancing resolutions under the Congressional Review Act to clean up the mess from the Obama administration and deliver regulatory relief for hardworking men and women. In fact, 5 out of the 14 of the CRA resolutions that were signed into law originated from this committee. And just last week, the House passed the Save Local Business Act to roll back the Obama-era joint employer scheme that threatens 1.7 million jobs, according to the American Action Forum. We know the department has its work cut out after 8 years of an unprecedented regulatory rampage, but we look forward to building on the progress we've made together so we can get government out of the way and unleash prosperity and opportunity. There are also a number of issues impacting retirement security that deserve our attention. This includes a need to protect access to affordable retirement advice and empower more Americans to plan for the future. As a department that oversees so many important priorities, I feel I barely scratched the surface. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so Mr. Secretary, thank you again for joining us. I look forward to our conversation, With that, I recognize Ranking Member Bobby Scott for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Secretary Acosta for appearing before the committee. Secretary Acosta, you are the first agency head to appear before this committee. We have jurisdiction over health and human services, education, as well as labor. You're the first one to come before the committee since the administration took over 10 months ago. And I want to join the chair's criticism for the lateness of the arrival of your testimony, but also want to add that we're disappointed that you have given limited time, insufficient time for all of the committee members to ask 5-minute questions. It's been 6 months since the department's fiscal year 2018 budget request was submitted to Congress, and although we're already well into the fiscal year, this hearing is still timely since the appropriations legislation is still under deliberation. As a secretary, you are the steward of legislation this committee has passed over many decades that has made our economy fairer and workplaces safer. In appearing before this committee, I want to direct your attention to the portraits on the wall to your left. These leaders have secured passage of legislation that measurably improved the lives of millions of workers. Mary Norton, the first woman to chair the committee, who steered the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Carl Perkins, who spearheaded legislation to establish the Mine Safety and Health Administration. Augustus Hawkins, who authored Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Behind me is George Miller, who led the fight for the Fair Minimum Wage Act of 2007. Today, the Department of Labor bears the tremendous responsibility of implementing and enforcing employment laws covering about 10 million employers and about 125 million workers. However, in its first 10 months, there are troubling questions about whether this department has reversed important progress made in previous administrations and laid the groundwork to undermine workers' wages, retirement security, workplace safety, affordable health care, and skills development. First, the Department of Labor has taken steps to replace a rule issued by the previous administration that would have expanded overtime benefits for 4 million salaried workers. This rule increased the salary threshold beneath which most full-time salaried workers would be eligible for overtime pay from $23,660 to over $47,000 and covers 35% of full-time salaried workers. Unfortunately, a district court in Texas blocked this rule, and regrettably, the department under your leadership decided not to defend this threshold in the Court of Appeals. Rather, DOL has indicated in recent court filings that it will issue a revised overtime threshold. And I understand in Senate testimony, Mr. Secretary, you mentioned $33,000 as overtime salary threshold based on an inflation adjustment, but there are legitimate questions about where to set the baseline before you adjust for inflation. Do you base it on the 2004 level when 13% of the full-time salary workforce had overtime protection? Or do we base it on the 1975 levels when 62% had overtime protections? Second, the department is seeking a delay in protections for retirement savers. A study by the previous administration found as much as a quarter of a worker's hard-earned savings can be depleted by conflicted financial advice over 35 years. In response, the previous administration required financial advisors to put the best interests of their clients above their self-interest. Rather than bolstering workers' ability to save for more retirement, there are questions about whether the department's actions regarding the fiduciary rule are placing the demands of Wall Street ahead of the interests of workers. Third, in line with the administration's overall efforts to sabotage the Affordable Care Act, the department has taken steps that would leave workers and their families without access to comprehensive affordable health care. The department has released an interim rule that allows employers to eliminate coverage in their health care benefits plans for contraceptive care based on religious or vaguely defined moral objections. This is squarely at odds with the Affordable Care Act's requirement that preventive health services are covered and raises legitimate questions about the Constitution. The department has also been directed to expand access to association plans, association health plans, which, as the committee has heard over and over again, would steer young, healthy people into low-cost junk plans and leave sicker and higher-cost people behind, thereby increasing the price for everybody that doesn't get into one of these health plans. Fourth, worker safety protections are under attack. While previous administration rules helped end the scourge of black lung disease and prevent deaths from silica-related diseases, the current DOL proposed a rollback of protections for construction and shipyard workers who were exposed to the toxic beryllium and has jettisoned work on standards for toxic chemicals and combustible dust. It is unclear whether DOL will finalize a December 1 deadline for employers and higher hazard industries to submit summaries of their injury and illness logs. And without this data, Mr. Secretary, there are questions about how OSHA will secure information needed to target inspections to those work sites where workers are greatest at risk. You're aware that only a relatively few inspections can actually be made. We want to make sure they're targeted, and without this information, that can't be done. Fifth, the Department's budget request for fiscal 2018 cuts funding for workforce development programs by $1.3 billion, which is a 40% reduction compared to current levels. This cut threatens access to job and skills development programs that workers need to secure better paying jobs. And while I hope the expansion of apprenticeships remains a bipartisan issue, there are questions regarding the Department's plans. For example, the Department has signaled that it will allow federal support for apprenticeships relying solely on employer-established standards, but there is no clarity on whether this will produce high-quality transferable skills and credentials comparable to registered apprenticeships, and no indication of how we will ensure that federal dollars are only spent on quality programs. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to your testimony and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished witness. The Honorable R. Alexander Acosta is the Secretary for the U.S. Department of Labor. Among his career highlights, Secretary Acosta has served in 3 presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed positions. In 2002, he was appointed to serve as a member of the National Labor Relations Board. In 2003, he was appointed Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and from 2005-2009, he served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. Secretary Acosta, I ask you to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect Secretary Acosta answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me briefly remind you of our lighting system. We typically allow 5 minutes for each witness to present, although I'll be somewhat flexible with your testimony given you are our only witness today. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. At the 5-minute mark, the light will turn red. Members will each have 3 minutes to ask questions, and we understand you have a busy afternoon and have asked for a hard stop at noon. Secretary Acosta, you're recognized.
Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to appear today. And let me just say I'm honored to be the first cabinet officer to appear before your committee. I found out about that just a minute ago. I appreciate the opportunity to appear here to represent the administration and the hardworking men and women of the Department of Labor and to provide an update on our critical work. At the outset, let me just say this has been a remarkable year of growth for the American economy, for American workers, for American job seekers, and American job creators. Some highlights, as the chairwoman mentioned, since January 2017, the American economy has created nearly 1.5 million jobs. GDP has grown at 3% or more for 2 consecutive quarters. This in particular is great news for retirement savings. The unemployment rate has decreased from just under 5% to 4.1%, the lowest in 17 years, just about 17 years. And the number of open full-time positions in the American economy is at a near all-time high of 6.1 million open and unfilled jobs. Job creators want to hire, and job seekers want to work. And the fact that we have 6.1 million open jobs speaks to the strength of the American economy. Since becoming Labor Secretary, I've made it a point to travel, to leave Washington when I can, and visit different places across the nation. I visited the Ford Rouge facility in Michigan, where a new F-150 rolls off the assembly line every 49 seconds. And I met with some apprentices there that are doing amazing work and also receiving wonderful and strong workplace education. The National Training Center for the United Brotherhoods of Carpenter in Nevada is another place that I visited. If you haven't been there, I would commend that to you. It looks like a modern university. It's a very high-tech, very high-touch training center. I went to the graduation program for dozens of steam fitters and pipe fitters who are working hard to educate themselves so they could go back home and educate new apprentices, a train the trainers program. Throughout my travels, one thing struck me as very clear. Our nation's workforce is an amazing workforce. It's the American workforce, and it is why we are doing so well as a country. It is the best workforce in the world, which is one reason why we need to focus so much on workforce education. And so we at the department are hard at work to increase employment opportunities for all Americans, to enforce safe, healthy, and fair workplaces, to promote strong benefit programs, and to ensure that the department's regulations are common sense regulations that make sense. And so I think it's particularly, as the chairwoman mentioned, fitting that I'm here this week. That's National Apprenticeship Week. On Monday, I chaired the inaugural meeting of the President's Task Force on Apprenticeship Expansion. President Trump signed an executive order on apprenticeship expansion, and this is an issue that is so important. We should be growing apprenticeships in this nation. Members of the task force included leaders from business, from labor, from educational associations, from trade associations, to governors, community organization leaders, public individuals, all coming together to talk about how to expand apprenticeships across industries, especially into those industries where apprenticeships are underrepresented. One important takeaway from that meeting was that the apprenticeship programs as currently envisioned are not scaling. They are not growing at the rate that they could grow. Currently, it's 0.3% of the American workforce, and the vision is to scale and to grow these further. And we're engaged in discussions as to how to do that. Let me also say that the Trump administration is focusing on expanding access to health coverage. On October 20th, the President signed an executive order directing the Department to consider how to best allow for more employers to form associations and offer association health plans. Yesterday, the Department sent to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs a notice of proposed rulemaking regarding AHPs. That notice became public this morning. Finally, in conclusion, let me say on November 9th, the Charlotte Observer published an op-ed that was co-authored by the chairwoman and myself. And I want to sort of conclude by reading from this op-ed because I do think it captures much of what we're looking for on the workforce education issue. And it says, when Americans make career choices, they should be encouraged to consider a broad range of options that fit their diverse talents and interests. For many, their career path will take them to higher education. That was the case for us, referring to Dr. Fox and myself. A university degree is right for many young people, yet it is not the only route to career success. We need to change the perception of a single right career path. To that end, we're encouraging leaders from business, labor, educational institutions, and trade associations to recognize the benefits of apprenticeships. It goes on to say we're partners when it comes to modernizing the workplace education process. With over 6 million Americans looking for jobs and more than 6 million open jobs nationwide, it's time to modernize how we prepare Americans for the workforce. And that starts with a commitment to respecting all career choices Americans make to develop the skills that will lead them to excellent family-sustaining and to excel in family-sustaining jobs. And finally, let me just acknowledge that my written testimony did not make the committee's deadline. I apologize for that. The responsibility is mine. I heard your comments. I am not happy that it did not make the deadline, but it is on me, and I do want to apologize to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acosta. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we will have to, because I believe in the interest of all the members here, to give every member an opportunity to ask questions because of the hard stop, we will confine our questioning time to 3 minutes. I will recognize myself for 3 minutes. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the recent efforts to encourage success in the Job Corps program, including by suspending or ending individual center operations when those centers consistently fail to meet the needs of the students. What additional actions will the department take to ensure student safety and hold center operators accountable?
Chairwoman, thank you for the question, and let me note that we received a very detailed letter with questions from your office. We're in the process of answering those. They touch upon other agencies as well, because as the chairwoman's aware, the Department of Agriculture runs several of the Job Corps centers, and so we're in the interagency process on those. To address your question specifically, we're very concerned about the level of safety and the level of violence in these Job Corps centers. We've implemented a zero-tolerance policy where if individuals engage in violence or if there's safety concerns, the individuals will not be at the job center. They will not be part of the program. That zero-tolerance policy is a start. In my opinion, we need to take a hard look at how the Job Corps centers are organized. We need to ask if it makes sense to have such a broad range of ages within a Job Corps center. Currently, there's some centers that have students ranging in age from 16 to 25, all housed in a residential center. And for me, that is an issue of grave concern. And I think more broadly, we need to look at the Job Corps Center and a program and measure it based on outputs as opposed to inputs. It is not how many students are there, but how many students graduate, how many students go on to get jobs, how successful are the centers. I think sometimes we just measure, and you see this sometimes in higher education, where many people are familiar with the enrollments, but they're less familiar with the graduation rates and the job rates. And taking a page from a trend that we see in higher education accreditation that focuses on output measures, I think it's important that the job centers also focus on output measures.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You may not have enough time to answer this entire question, but I want to get it on the record and then ask that we get a more robust response from you. I appreciate the department's actions in rescinding the harmful persuader rule, but I'd like to ask about what further plans you have for the Office of Labor Management Standards, OLMS. Specifically, what steps will you take to ensure this agency can again provide robust oversight on behalf of union workers? And again, in the interest of time, I will ask that you give us a written response to that so that I don't impinge on the time of other members.
Certainly, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. I understand the ranking member will defer, and so I will recognize Ms. Davis for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for joining us this morning. I know that you agree with me on the importance of apprenticeships, and in your testimony, you describe a system where sector-by-sector standards would be set by certified subject matter experts. Along with a few of my colleagues, I had the opportunity to visit Switzerland and to take what we all thought was a reasonably deep dive into their system and to understand the infrastructure that has been built around it, of course, over many years. It was clear to us that while the industries lead the programs, that there is government involvement in establishing the prestige and the quality of apprenticeships. Could you give us, and I know with a short amount of time, but where do you see that federal role? And could you address the registration process, certification, and really what happens with federal dollars, especially if we need to mitigate against what people might call, quick upstarts that aren't providing the kind of background that students need?
you know, that you and I do share a great interest in apprenticeship programs. They are critical. And as we go forward, it is critical and important that we maintain high-quality apprenticeships. As we talk to leaders across the nation, there's great interest, but the registered apprenticeship program is viewed as cumbersome. The registration process with the Department of Labor takes a long time. In addition to registering at the Department of Labor, individuals have to register with various state workforce committees. And so an individual that, or a company that is interested in, let's say, having 30 or 40 apprenticeships, by the time they look at the registration process at the Department of Labor, and then the registration process with various state workforce committees, they're making a calculus that maybe they shouldn't engage at all. And that is unfortunate. And so what we're looking to do is develop a system that can streamline the certification process, that in essence would be flexible and would really depend industry by industry. So for example, let's take the building trades. In the building trades, you have these labor management groups that come together, and they've really scaled up these apprenticeship programs in amazing ways. The building trades spend nearly $1 billion of private sector money, no federal money involved actually, private sector money setting up 1,600 centers across the nation. And so the vision is, wouldn't it be wonderful if we can find ways to bring parties together, labor, management, trade associations, in setting up apprenticeships that are scalable, that have portable credentials that can go from institution to institution.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know that we're talking beyond the trades as well, and they've provided a great example, but I hope that you'll be open as well to sort of seeing how we integrate that, because I think what we heard repeatedly there was that you do need to have that overarching role, and I appreciate your concern.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Dr. Rowe, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary, to the committee. I'm going to ask 3 very quick questions. One, I'm very excited about the association health plans. As a business owner, a small business owner, being able to associate and then to buy insurance across the state line has incredible opportunities to help us lower costs and increase and provide more affordable coverage for people. So we see the success in the self-insured plans. We see success in the Christian sharing ministries. Could you just very briefly go over where we are with that and when you think that will be rolled out?
Certainly. As I mentioned, the draft was sent to OMB this morning and is pending at OMB. I'm limited in how much I can talk about it, as it's currently still a draft for internal circulation. But let me just say, association health plans generally will provide and do provide an opportunity for often small businesses to come together and create scale. That scale will reduce the cost of health care in important ways. First, because there is scale, there is more negotiating power with health insurers. Because there is scale, rather than every business having to have its own plan that it administers, there's one central administration. And so that also reduces cost. And finally, because there's a larger risk pool, the variation lessens as the risk pool grows, as you well know. And as a result, there's more predictability, there's more certainty, and therefore the cost of uncertainty is lessened and not passed on to the American individual who is buying health care. And so for all those and other reasons, if you look at association health plans, there is a history of them reducing the price and benefiting the consumer.
I totally agree. I'm very excited about it being able to group up and get larger where our business is, and I know it will lower our costs. Second, very quickly, I have a passion and have always had for pension savings. And, one of my concerns, certainly agree with the best interest standards. I agree with my colleagues on that, completely do. But my concern on fiduciary rule is that it would lower income people and new businesses, because I was a new business at one time in my life, and we were able to start a pension plan without a fiduciary and then grow our plan to where we then did have a fiduciary. Could you just comment on where that rulemaking is right now? Congressman,
as you're aware, the best interest standard went into effect in June. The other part of that rule, which had to do with many of the remedies and the remedy options that are available, are the subject of a notice of proposed rulemaking that is pending at OMB. The title of that notice would make clear that that there is an 18-month extension if that notice goes forward.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Dr. Crowe. Mr. Courtney, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I just begin because of the short time. Mr. Secretary, I would invite you to come up to Eastern Connecticut and see a sizing up of apprenticeships programs that's been happening over the last 2 years, seeded by federal dollars through the Workforce Innovation Fund from the U.S. Department of Labor, using Fitzgerald Act standards, which again applies not only to the shipyard where we're recapitalizing the submarine force with the Virginia-class program, but also the supply chain, the small guys who, again, had initial fears about taking on apprenticeship regulations and found actually that the process was very, very flexible and manageable. So again, I think you would, benefit from seeing, again, a sizing up, dramatic sizing up, 3,000 hires this year again, we move forward to enlarge our undersea fleet. And again, I have a letter from the Eastern Connecticut Workforce Board, which again has data and statistics about the, again, tremendous success that's happening with Fitzgerald Act standards in place, Madam Chairwoman.
Without objection.
The other question I just wanted to jump in really quickly is that a number of us have been working on workplace violence trends that are happening. Again, your department reported this year an uptick in workplace violence, 27,000 incidents reported last year, up from the prior year. Again, the last administration committed to using the General Duties Clause under the OSHA to develop workplace standards and guidelines to help again, the front lines in the opioid crisis who are dealing with what's coming through the emergency room doors with violent patients that are causing serious injuries. We had an event here in the Capitol where a nurse from the state of Connecticut who worked at a psych unit, Helene Andrews, was punched out by a young man, shattered her hip and femur bone, and again is permanently handicapped as a result of that. This is a real issue, and the fact that the department has suspended that initiative, which took place and has been the result of a GAO study, is, again, kind of amazing to those of us who've been following this issue. Do you believe that workplace violence is an issue for your department to set up standards and help people, again, who are trying to do the right thing, the caregivers in our society?
Congressman, thank you for both questions. First, with respect to the first, quickly, let me say I appreciate the comments. I've actually heard very, very good things about that particular shipyard. And just to put something on the table and allay any concerns, irrespective of what alternatives we provide, the registered apprenticeship program is going forward. This does not have to be an either-or proposition. We are interested in expanding the apprenticeship program, but that does not mean that we would pull back on anything that is already working. With respect to the second point, certainly workplace violence is a very important issue to address, and I'm happy to maybe follow up with your staff, get some more details on your particular concern, and address it in follow-up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney. Mr. Guthrie, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I appreciate it. With the previous administration, I worked extensively with them on ESOPs. I've seen experience and seen the employee stock ownership plans. One particularly in my district is not just giving people retirement security, but great wealth when they retired. People who worked in grocery stores retiring, they had to have financial counseling just so they could learn how to handle how much their lifestyle would increase after they retired, which is kind of the goal of what we would all like to see. Not every ESOP's that way. The problem is in the last 7 years, the previous administration, enforcements against ESOPs there were more enforcements against ESOPs in the past 35 years. So there's a concern, I know in the ESOP community, that the Department of Labor, maybe previously, but just I'd like to talk about ESOPs and your view of them. We're trying to not increase ESOPs or move forward. And understand the argument is, well, we don't want people's entire retirement tied up in one enterprise. But I think we've learned with defined benefit programs that we're still struggling to try to deal with, they are tied up in the existence of one in a single enterprise. Just because you have a guaranteed pension, if your business goes out of business that they guaranteed it to you, you lose that guarantee. So for a good example was whenever there was an enforcement opportunity against, or enforcement action against an ESOP, it started with subpoenas. It didn't start with, let's go in and see what's moving forward. And I think everybody here would say there needs to be adequate regulation and appropriate enforcement. So I would like, if you would talk about ESOPs and your view of them, and is the Department of Labor intentionally trying to keep them from growing? And would you be willing, I know we've talked about this just publicly, we talk about working with the ESOP community to make sure, one, people are protected, but two, that they're allowed to create the wealth that they create for people.
Congressman, thank you for the question, and I think it's important because let me start off by making the broad statement that we, as a policy matter, do not have any concerns about ESOPs, and in fact, I think ESOPs have many advantages. Making employees part owners provides some skin in the game, so to speak. It empowers individuals. I think many companies have done quite well using ESOPs as part of their strategy to make employees feel like they're part of the company. One topic that one subject that I like to talk about in the apprenticeship context is let's not make something a job, let's make something a career path. Let's have, for example, a cashier to store manager series of workforce education programs so that someone feels that they're not just doing a job, but that they have a career path within a certain employer.
I have like 5 seconds left, and I just want to just say that Beverly Tobin Ford, who's with the Great Onyx Job Corps at Mammoth Cave, is here today. She was in town and is attending the hearing, and so I know she's interested in Job Corps issues as well. So I appreciate that. I know the chairman's going to take my time, so I wanted to bring that up. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie. Ms. Fudge, you're recognized for 3 minutes, excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Mr. Secretary, do you or the department support the right to organize and collectively bargain?
Yes, both I and the department recognize individuals' right to organize and to collectively bargain.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we are rapidly approaching the 2020 census, and we know that it is mandated by Constitution, and we know why we have it, because so many resources are determined by what's in the census. But past directors have said it is woefully underfunded. What are you doing to ensure that we have an accurate census in 2020?
Well, Congresswoman, I certainly think that having an accurate census is important and critical. As you're aware, the statistical agency within the Department of Labor is the Bureau of Labor Statistics that conducts surveys on unemployment rates, on open jobs, and it does work with the Department of the Census, or with the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau, I would argue, however, is under the Department of Commerce, and as a result, the primary budget responsibility for the census really should go to the Department of Commerce. Let me say, though, that the statistical agencies all work very closely, and I'm certainly happy to take this back to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and ask them if they have any suggestions that I could then pass along to my colleague, Secretary Ross.
Okay, I just want to bring to your attention that right now we believe that it is significantly underfunded, and we want to be sure that we have an accurate census. So thank you for looking into it. Mr. Secretary, in October of this year, the administration announced 2 interim final rules that would allow moral and religious objections to contraceptive coverage. On what legal authority did you do that?
Well, Congresswoman, as you mentioned, the interim final rules that were announced allow a religious exemption to contraceptive coverage. It does not mandate, but it allows individuals to exercise.
I understand what it does. I said, on what legal authority did you do it?
Correct. It allows individuals to exercise that option. Those rules were enacted pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act. The APA is well known and is set out by Congress, and it allows agencies to enact rules through proper notice and comment. And all those rules went through APA, they went through the OMB process, and they were promulgated in full accordance with the
So it's
law.
not based in law, it's just based in process, policy. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barletta, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Secretary Acosta, thank you for being here today. I'm honored to serve as the Republican co-chair of the Job Corps Caucus because it is a program that I truly believe in, and I've seen the benefits of it firsthand. In my hometown of Hazleton, the Keystone Job Corps Center plays a significant role in our community. Back when I was mayor, students from the Keystone helped build sidewalks around City Hall and design trash receptacles during the downtown beautification project. I've also had numerous Job Corps students intern in my Hazleton district office. This is a program that truly benefits everyone involved. That's why I was disappointed to see earlier this year the Employment and Training Administration, which falls within your department, announced severe cuts to Job Corps' student slots despite a 1% funding increase from Congress. I appreciate that your department rescinded these cuts just last week, but I would also like to make sure that a similar situation doesn't arise in the future. Can you please provide any information on why ETA initially sought to cut Job Corps student slots despite a funding increase from Congress? And given that Job Corps faced fiscal management and contracting challenges under the Obama administration, can you please detail what you're doing to ensure that ETA is appropriately managing the Job Corps' budget?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And, you know, I noted that there was an article in, I believe, the Hazleton paper that addressed this issue more generally. Let me say the letter that went out from the ETA agency within the Department of Labor, my understanding, that went out in anticipation of what would be perceived as a funding reduction, when in fact, as you just mentioned, the funding reduction did not materialize. And although we don't have a final conference bill, you know, it appears, at least on the House side and on the Senate side, that there is, the funding reduction may not materialize in fact. And given that we have rescinded the letter, now if the funding levels change, then obviously we will have to address that. Let me say more generally, you know, it might make sense, and if there is a Job Corps caucus, to start a discussion among the co-chairs of that caucus, because the Job Corps program, in one way, is a wonderful program that provides a lot of workforce education and can lead to jobs, it can change lives. In another way, there are, as the chairwoman mentioned, significant safety concerns. There are inefficiencies. There are many sole source contracts that raise concerns for me. Sole sourcing is not the traditional way to issue government contracts. And I think it is appropriate for a more fulsome discussion so that we can determine how best to use the taxpayer dollars in a way that fulfills the mission that you just mentioned, putting individuals to work.
Thank you, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Mr. Barletta. Mr. Polis, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott. Secretary Acosta, as you share, this is National Apprenticeship Week, and I think we all agree apprenticeships are a promising educational model to help put students on a path towards strong, good-paying jobs. In Colorado, we recently launched CareerWise, which pairs students with apprenticeships in fields like finance or technology. Several hundred high school students today are participating, in addition to the registered union apprenticeships that we've had for many years in Colorado. These apprenticeships are especially valuable when they're also tied to dual and concurrent enrollment credit, transferable, should a student choose to go on to a 2-year or 4-year university. Currently, employers can provide up to $5,250 of tax-free education assistance to their employees. This provision in our tax code is really a linchpin of helping to incentivize apprenticeships and continuing education. Unfortunately, the House tax bill, in its current form that we're voting on this week, eliminates that benefit. Secretary Acosta, do you support eliminating employer-sponsored education assistance from the tax code?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Let me just note at the outset, it sounds like these are examples of apprenticeships that aren't registered apprenticeships, and precisely the types of apprenticeships that, as you just mentioned, we want to support and expand, which goes back to the earlier discussion about should there be alternatives to the registered apprenticeship. And one of the topics that the task force is going to take up is what are the appropriate incentives to provide to support apprenticeships. Now, the tax code is a large and complex code, and we want to strive to make it fairer and simpler and simplified. And so, putting aside whether or not this particular provision is the most appropriate, let me just say that obviously we want to find ways to support and incentivize apprenticeship programs, whether registered or whether it sounds like this is a dual enrollment program where individuals are receiving great benefits.
But wouldn't it do the opposite of incentivizing it if you were to get rid of the deduction for employers to provide $5,000 of tax-free education assistance to their employees?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was speaking to the American Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities yesterday, and I made the point that universities offer a semester abroad and universities offer a semester at sea. And so why not offer a semester working in a public defender's office or a state attorney's office for pay as part of an apprenticeship program? Or why not offer a semester?
So that's correct. If you want all the students to do apprenticeships with the government and learn how to do government jobs, the tax incentive is not useful. But if you want them to do real jobs in the private sector, creating value, the tax incentive is very important. I have additional questions about protecting workers that I'll submit for the record since we're out of time. Certainly. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Polis. Mr. Byrne, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming today. One of the things that unites everybody around this table is we share your passion for doing something about the workforce development of all of our workers in America. I share your frustration with the number of duplicative and ineffective job programs within your agency and really across the national government. Within the Employment and Training Administration alone, there are nine programs administered primarily at the national level. So, two-part question. What can you do about that duplicative and ineffective problem we've got there? And what can we do to work with you to make sure we do something about all that?
Congressman, thank you for the question. So let me say this. I have spoken to governors from both sides of the aisle, all of whom have expressed frustration over the limitations on the spending in workforce education. They have said, my state is not like the other state, and my state is different, and in my particular state, I think we should do it this way. And I've heard from governors on both sides of the aisle on this. I have very little discretion in waiving restrictions on how to spend workforce money, and I have very few or very little discretion on how to eliminate duplicative programs. We have, in the budget that was submitted, asked for waiver authority, and I've told governors that I'm all, that I would favor waiver authority so long as governors would provide a plan for this is how we're going to do it, and this is the important part, and an outcome goal. And so for me, it's less a question of how are you going to spend it and more, are you going to provide this number of graduates, this number of job opportunities? How do you develop the outcomes? Ultimately, those questions are in Congress, and you have the authority to authorize waivers or not. You have the authority to merge those programs. We've asked for that in the budget documents, but that authority will come to Congress.
I'm going to ask my last question. You may not be able to finish it in the time you've got, so if you could give me a written supplement, I'd appreciate it. As you're aware, many multi-employer pension plans are underfunded, which threatens the entire system, and the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which backstops multi-employer plans, estimates that there are more than 100 multi-employer pension plans that are in critical or declining status. I know Chairman Wahlberg, who leads our HELP subcommittee, is well aware of these issues and takes them very seriously. What steps are you taking to address this issue that threatens retirement security?
Congressman, this is a critical issue. It is an issue that that has not been fully addressed in the past and that is rapidly, not rapidly becoming, but actually is past the point where there is an easy solution. This is something that we will have to work closely with Congress on, and I'm happy to follow up.
Well, my time's up. If you would give us a more thorough written response, I would appreciate it. Now yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Acosta, thank you for being here. You are the first cabinet-level secretary to be at this committee this year, and I trust the chairwoman and members agree that hearing from representatives of this administration is important to, especially to our oversight responsibilities, and I hope we'll see Secretary DeVos and the HHS Secretary here soon. So there are many issues we're discussing today. I'm going to focus my time on the ability of Oregonians and Americans to plan and save for secure retirement. We were making some progress under the Obama administration. It seems that some of that progress is being rolled back. So I have to start a few yes or no questions. Most Americans are not spending their days studying the financial markets. They rely on advisors to help them invest for retirement. So do you agree that saving for retirement involves significant financial decisions and that Oregonians and Americans deserve financial advice that's in their best interest?
Congresswoman, obviously I do agree that saving for retirement involves significant financial decisions and that they should receive the best financial advice available, advice consistent with how they choose to receive advice and advice that is...
And I'm going to reclaim my time because I have some more questions. Is everyone who is saving for retirement in the United States now getting advice that is in their best interest?
And so Congresswoman, everyone is a very broad statement. It is, you know, there are millions and millions of individual Americans, and we at the department prosecute cases where individuals have not received appropriate advice, and so everyone certainly is far too broad.
Well, and again, reclaiming my time, we sat in this committee room and had unanimous members of the financial industry say people investing deserve advice that's in their best interest. So I hope that the department will indeed implement the conflict of interest fiduciary rule. Will you provide assurance to the American public who are trying to save for retirement that the department will protect their hard-earned retirement savings?
Congresswoman, we are working quite diligent to do what is in the best interest of, as my colleague at the SEC has said, Mr. and Mrs. 401k. We understand that Americans have worked very hard for their retirement savings. It is important to protect those retirement savings.
I appreciate that, and I want to get another question in. So workers in Oregon and across the country with limited access to employer-sponsored retirement programs have limited access, and Congress has not expanded access to those programs. So some states, including Oregon, stepped up and established retirement savings programs for private sector workers who do not have an employer-sponsored plan. But this year, congressional Republicans passed and President Trump signed legislation that nullified rules that make it easier for states and localities to set up these programs. So what would you say to the workers now whose access to good retirement savings programs is in jeopardy? What should they do now?
Congresswoman, this goes to a broader question, and I do think it is important, particularly as BLS comes out with a study on the gig economy this spring, that we engage in a larger discussion so that individuals that have various employment relationships can have access to employer benefits.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Lewis, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Over the past few years, this committee has conducted numerous hearings focusing on the department's overtime rulemaking, which was initiated by the Obama administration in 2014, I believe. The committee has had significant concerns with the previous administration's approach. We've heard testimony about the negative effects of this rulemaking, especially on small businesses, nonprofit organizations, institutions of higher education, among a number of stakeholders adversely impacted. In July, the Wage and Hour Division initiated a request, as we understand it, for information related to the overtime regulations for white-collar employees. Mr. Secretary, could you provide us with an update on the department's efforts with respect to the information collected, where we are in this process, how it's going to be used to inform the revisions going forward, and what kind of clarity we'll need for reviewing the information?
Certainly, Congressman. As the Congressman's aware, this was also brought up in a federal court, and the federal court enjoined the implementation of that overtime rule. I've said previously, and I'll just repeat here, it hasn't been updated since 2004, and it is in need of updating. Life has become much more expensive. Going to the 47,000 level not only created a shock to the system, what was found to be unlawful by a federal court. And so the request for information allowed us to gather data, to ask some important questions to the public about how we are going to write a new overtime rule that will be in accordance with legal standards. We are in the process of doing that. I believe we received over 200,000 comments, and we're in the process of reviewing those comments. Let me also say that we have appealed the decision, and we have appealed it because that decision was somewhat, we believe it was clear, but it could be read as less than clear with respect to the department's authority to set the overtime rule in the first place. And one of the issues with the overreach is it brought into question the department's authority. And so we are appealing that decision to have certainty that the department actually has the authority to write this rule, which I believe we do.
Any personal views on if, once you get the authority, the deleterious effects of having the executive agency determine who's a manager and who isn't and at what level they should be paid?
Well, you know, the Department of Labor has been in, we have determined that for decades now, right? And so the overtime rule has been in effect. The focus of this particular exercise is to update it, and it does need to be updated. There's certainly room for a broader discussion, but for now, this particular question on the table is, how should the overtime rule be updated? Hasn't been updated since 2004, and it really is in need of updating.
All right, my time is up. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm eager to ask you about the administration's priorities. Mr. Secretary, I had prepared longer remarks, but since we're short on time, I just want to note that on the issues of joint employer, the fiduciary rule, and worker safety, this administration has consistently sided with business interests instead of workers and worker advocates. And I find that deeply troubling. But I want to focus right now on the overtime rule. In 1975, more than 60% of full-time salary workers fell below the salary threshold for overtime protections. In 2016, that number was less than 7%. The Obama rule would have covered 30% of salaried workers at the $47,000 level and change. But the threshold of around 31,000 only covers 13%, a mere uptick of maybe 4 or 5 percentage points of the workforce that's covered. I would argue this is not a time for modest change. We needed to update this a long time ago. And I understand the shock argument, but really, we're talking about only 7% of salary workers being covered. I think it's time to stand with American workers who deserve to be paid for their overtime. Let me just say that last year the Obama administration issued a rule that would have expanded overtime protections to over 4 million workers and strengthened protections for an additional 9 million. That salary threshold under the rule was set just above $47,000 and was supported by the National Employment Law Project and other worker advocates. Big business organizations, including the Chamber of Commerce, believe that the threshold should have been significantly lower. Now, does the administration support the threshold set by the Obama administration and supported by worker advocates, or does it support the business community's position?
Congressman, thank you for the question, and let me note at the outset, when we talk about the overtime rule, we tend to talk about it in the context of salary thresholds. But if you look at the law passed by this Congress did not say whether or not you are exempt or non-exempt, whether or not you're subject to overtime or not, is set by a salary level. But it set a very different test. And so the salary level is, in essence, a shorthand way of getting to the law. Now, a federal court looked at this, and the federal court said that the way the $47,000 was set and that level was not in accordance with the law. And so it's not simply, do we support?
And you chose not to contest or appeal that decision, and you do believe that that you have the authority to set the salary threshold. Is that correct?
And so I was saying it's irrespective of whether we support or not, and we chose not to support that level because we believe both it is a shock to the system and not in accordance with the law. We do believe we have authority to set a salary level that acts as a proxy for the test set out in the
Just to
statute.
be clear, you do believe you have the authority, but yet your department chose not to appeal that decision.
Congressman, we appealed the decision with respect to the authority, not with respect to the salary level.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you. My time is up. I yield back.
Yep, the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Wahlberg, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the chairman and thank the secretary for being here. Appreciate a number of things that you have pushed forward and worked on. Let me ask you, the retirement security issue is big on our venue and our consideration. Policies that empower Americans to put money aside for retirement is a leading priority for this committee. The safe harbor, annuity safe harbor issue, we believe needs some more clarity in how it's dealt with. So let me ask you this question. Does the department plan to revise the existing annuity safe harbor to make sure it provides the certainty that plan sponsors need to consider these types of products?
Congressman, I will have to consult with the department and get back to you with that answer.
Well, I'd appreciate that. That is an issue that comes up as we consider the PBGC question, and that was addressed thus far. Anything relative to making sure that we have safe harbors, that we have better opportunity, it would be greatly appreciated. So, yes.
Let me just say, as a general matter, I think safe harbors are very important. I think there is a value to certainty and predictability, and that value is substantial, and so I understand the premise of your question.
Okay. Thank you. Jumping over to a totally different area, silica. Under the previous administration, OSHA promulgated a new rule related to the exposure of silica in the construction industry that I and many other members of Congress have concerns with. We believe it's extremely challenging for many in the construction industry to implement and comply with this rule. Are you willing to further stay the enforcement of this rule until you've worked to ensure that this rule is feasible and your employees are able to adequately educate employers throughout the country?
Congressman, thank you again. The Silica Rule is a major rule. My understanding is that it is in litigation. My understanding is that the parties were close to resolution as to what would be a sensible outcome. We provided a 30-day extension to provide the parties time to address this. The parties were a little late at coming back to the table, but it is my hope that the parties can come together, that they can express their concerns, and that we can find a sensible outcome to this rule.
That would be an improvement, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Blunt-Rochester, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, Ranking Member Scott, and Secretary Acosta for being here. In your testimony, your written testimony, you briefly discussed employment of people with disabilities, and as I'm sure you're aware, nearly 1 in 5 Americans have a disability, about almost 57 million individuals. And in the interest of time, I'll submit the bulk of my questions in writing, but I would love to hear about competitive integrated employment, also collaboration amongst agencies like RSA, and how you're going to work together. But because I have very limited time, I want to focus on one other question. The President's proposed budget calls for about a 40% cut to Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs. and also the elimination of the Senior Community Service Employment Program, even though Congress just reauthorized the Older Americans Act on a bipartisan basis. What is the rationale behind eliminating the Senior Community Service Employment Program?
Congresswoman, briefly, first let me say that I thank you for the questions on individuals with disabilities. And something that I heard that I thought was a useful way to think about this is that we're all temporarily abled, because at some point in our life, most of us at some point will have a disability, particularly as time goes by. Going to your second question, the hope in the budget, and ultimately that will be up to Congress, and Congress may not agree, is to try to consolidate all the disparate programs into one large program so that there are efficiencies, so that there are flexibilities at the state level. The budget made some hard decisions, and Congress has the discretion to change those decisions, to pass the budget that it wishes. But the intent of the budget was to, rather than have the money in separate programs, to combine them into one large program.
So, Mr. Secretary, it's my understanding that on this program in particular, which has been around maybe since 1965, that the performance measures, the program actually exceeded the performance measures. So can you just help me understand, if you're going to consolidate, wouldn't you maybe get rid of programs that aren't effective, but maintain ones that impact senior citizens across our country?
Well, by consolidating, it doesn't mean that the program isn't in existence. It means that it's not a separate budget item. But where it is successful, I would argue you want to continue programs that are successful, that have positive outcomes, and you want to look at those outcome measures and focus the monies, whether they come through a general budget line or through a specific budget line, on just those outcomes. So we're getting to the same end point.
Yeah, my time has expired, but I would encourage you to support senior employment programs in addition to employment of people with disabilities. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Smucker, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'd like to just take briefly a minute or so to thank you for your leadership in the department, and thank the administration for the focus on creating opportunity for Americans through job creation, through creating an environment where businesses are focused on growing and creating those jobs. I can tell you that businesses in my area are responding. Just was part of a roundtable recently in my area where a business owner, a family farm, said, we feel like we've been unleashed again. And so businesses are investing, they're growing their businesses, and they're creating jobs. So thank you so much. It's refreshing to see that kind of approach and that kind of focus. I'm also very pleased with the attention and focus on apprenticeship program. One of the things I've always noticed, having served in the state Senate and now in this position, you have individuals who are unemployed, and at the same time, you have businesses, on the other hand, who are looking to fill jobs, and it's becoming, they're almost desperate to fill jobs. And so what it really takes, and in fact, the best way to promote upward mobility, promote lifting people out of poverty, is connecting people with great paying jobs that are available. I think apprenticeship program is a tremendous tool to do that. It's one that's been underutilized here, so I'm very, very thrilled with the initiative. I look forward to working the administration to create scalable apprenticeship programs across the country. And with that, I have about a minute. I do have a question. One of the areas that businesses have been concerned about in my district is on OSHA compliance. And in fact, employers understand that it is important to provide a safe workplace, a healthy workplace for their employees, but are concerned about the approach that OSHA has taken over the past number of years, where it's more punitive rather than collaborative. So I'd like to hear your thought on that. What ideas do you have to create an environment where businesses are receiving assistance to comply and to ensure that they have a safe workplace?
Congressman, thank you for your words and thank you for the question. Briefly, let me say, on the one hand, we have asked for additional funding for a program called VPP, which is in essence, a compliance assistance program, a voluntary compliance program. And as a general matter, where you have employers that are trying to do the right thing, you want to help them do the right thing. Let me say that has to be balanced with a vigorous enforcement program. And so where you have an employer that has engaged in repeated violations, in willful violations, my view is you have to enforce and enforce vigorously. And as a former U.S. attorney, if need be, you should even refer those where there's willful violations that result in death or serious harm, refer those for prosecution. And so I think it's important to have compliance assistance and a very fulsome compliance assistance for all those employers that are just trying to do the right thing, while we acknowledge that, as with every situation, the Congresswoman earlier asked me to say, does every American, not every employer is like that, and where the employer is repeated and willful, then there needs to be vigorous enforcement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Norcross, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Secretary Acosta, good to see you again. It seems we're hearing quite a bit about the apprenticeship program, which has been around since the Middle Ages, so we are slow. We're usually not that bad. They refer to it as the other four-year degree. It is a system that works. Unfortunately, the United States is primarily the building trades who are doing such a great job. And when you were asked about the job centers and some of the issues that were taking place there, I was really happy to hear you talk about graduation rates and does it lead to a job. The piece of paper on the wall means nothing if you have a job. When we were in Switzerland, they said the United States has the best trained unemployed people in the world, which goes to the point in the question that we want to talk about. White-collar, commercial jobs is a nice area that we can go into, but we want to make sure, particularly with the trades who have a proven history of doing this great, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Their graduation rates are between 80 and 90%. But what we had found over the course of the last decade, not everybody's following that. Everybody becomes a first-year apprentice and stays there. They never graduate, and this is indicative of a program that isn't working. So when you're looking at creating the next generation, are you going to keep the very issues that we talked about in mind, graduation rates, and does it lead to a job?
Congressman, absolutely. I think the outcome measurements are so critical, whether it's a university, whether it's an apprenticeship program, whether it is a hybrid. How many graduate and does it lead to a job is the goal, and that's what we should focus on.
One of the issues that we found, particularly coming off the Great Recession, is we have all these openings. Training somebody for a job that doesn't exist is nothing short of cruel. The cycles in the construction, ebbs and flows. So if we had the amount of people ready to go to work today, that means they were unemployed for many years. So the industry does react, but there's always a lag here. The system works remarkably well. And as you pointed out, with virtually no federal or state money. But there are standards, and we heard from others. Nobody wants to burden the employers. They have a great way of giving input, but everybody can't create their own standards and no core competency. So when we go to look at the new system, as Susan Davis talked about, we want to make sure that we're in partnership, that joint programs are the ones that work best. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Norcross. Mr. Ferguson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for being here today. A couple of questions. First of all, as I understand it, on July the 6th of this year, the Department of Labor published a request for information examining the fiduciary rule. Is that correct?
I don't recall if that's the exact date, but that's generally correct.
Okay, good. Now that the comment period is closed, I'm assuming the department is reviewing and considering the next steps.
Congressman, that is correct. We are.
Okay. Have there been discussions with the SEC on the next steps with the fiduciary regulation?
Congressman, in a Wall Street Journal opinion editorial that I published, I very publicly, as a matter of fact, suggested that the SEC should be a partner in this effort. The SEC declined to be a full partner in the past administration, and I do believe that they have an important role to play. They are part of the regulatory structure of this industry and should be a partner, and therefore, yes, we have had discussions.
That is good to hear, because we've heard a lot from our constituents that believe that the DOL and the SEC should be collaborating on this to address the issues and solve the problems associated with it. So thank you for your commitment to continue going down that road. Also, I want to just make a comment about the approval of the Georgia WESUP application. I know some of your staff came down to the district to look at one of our programs. I want to thank you so much for that support and learning what's going on in our district. You know, being able to do this and work with states, and particularly the Georgia Consortium for Advanced Technical Training, we see this as a great opportunity to begin to prepare our young people to go to work in a 21st century economy, and it's a step in aligning our education system with the direction that the economy is going. So I know that you and the administration are very much focused on closing the skills gaps. It's something that we believe is vitally important to do. And we believe that innovative apprenticeships are a very valuable part of this. So again, I want to thank you for the work that y'all are doing on that. I think that is something that every person on this committee can agree with, that preparing our young people to take advantage of the jobs that are being created is vitally important. So thank you. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I was interested in the response that you gave to Congresswoman Fudge, so I want to follow up for just a moment. Controlling family timing and size can be key to unlocking opportunities for economic success. Education and equality and access to contraception can help women complete their education, join the workforce. Planning, delaying, and spacing births will also appear to help women achieve their education and career goals. And so with all of the economic benefits that access to contraceptive brings, it seems a bit illogical to me for the department to issue interim final rules that erodes a woman's right to access comprehensive preventative health care. My question is, have you done a complete assessment of the number of women and their dependents and ERISA plans that could lose access to contraceptive coverage? And if so, what's the number?
Congresswoman, as I said previously, the rule recognizes that for some organizations, their religious freedom should allow them to not offer that coverage. It provides the option for that organization. It was enacted pursuant to the Administrative Procedures Act. Within the APA, there is a requirement that the APA process engage in a cost-benefit analysis, and that would be contained within that cost-benefit analysis. That's something that we certainly could provide to you or to your staff.
So you have done an assessment? You know how many? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that within any rule, there is a cost-benefit analysis that takes place, and that assessment is required by the Administrative Procedures Act. And so that assessment can certainly
let me just okay, thank you very much, and I would like to receive that. So, according to the National Women's Law Center, when we think about the wage, and someone raised raised questions about the minimum wage, the federal wage, minimum wage now is $7.25 an hour. The average cost of a full year's worth of birth control pills without insurance was the equivalent of 51 hours of work before the ACA's contraceptive benefit was imposed. And so when it's a fact that women on average are paid less than men, I don't see how I don't see how you justify forcing them to pay more than men for preventative health coverage, and I'll just submit my other questions to you, and thank you very much, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. Ms. Handel, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good morning. Thank you, Secretary, for being here. Just a quick question on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which, as you know, in July of 2016, instituted a new accountability program with measurable, defined performance indicators. Do you have a sense, a year plus later, about how this is working? Has it been effective? And if so, are there other programs within Department of Labor to which this type of approach could be applied?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I believe that it was, as you mentioned, instituted a year ago, and that states were responsible for submitting the outcomes, I believe, about 2 to 3 weeks ago. It was at some point in October. I don't remember the exact date. We're in the process of reviewing that data. Once that data is reviewed, I'm happy to provide further thoughts on what that data shows. I'd also like to say that while most states did submit the data, I believe that there are 7 states that are still working on the submission of that information. And we're providing
Hopefully Georgia is not one of them, and if so, if you would let me know so I can follow up.
I will. I believe there's 7. I don't remember all 7, but I will. We are working with them to provide compliance assistance so that they understand their responsibilities.
Super. If you would be willing to, once you've sorted through all of the data, either you or someone from your team, perhaps send something in writing to Chairman Fox for the whole committee, I think we would all be very interested in how the accountability program is playing out.
That is a fair request.
Super. Thank you so much, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Espaillat, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Before accepting the nomination to be Secretary of Labor, you were the Dean of, very successful, I may add, Dean of the Florida International Law School. Florida's International University has been at the forefront of standing with DACA students. Do you stand by Florida International's commitment to support and protect our DACA students?
Congressman, I appreciate your question. It is certainly my hope that Congress resolves this issue and finds a legal solution to this DACA issue. And I should add that it's the clock is ticking, and so I hope Congress does so expeditiously.
Thank you. Now, my district alone has 2,400 DACA recipients and a total of 5,800 total DACA eligible recipients. Removing these individuals from our workforce, experts have said, will decrease our GDP by an estimated $155 million. What in the world is going to happen? What are we going to do to fill this labor gap and other labor gaps across the country if this is not resolved? Do you have a plan for this as Secretary of Labor?
Congressman, we have a skills gap. We have a substantial skills gap, and we need to find a solution to DACA. It is my sincere hope that Congress can take this up and that Congress can find the solution.
Thank you. I am encouraged by your positive response, and I may add that unfortunately we have not heard that positive response by other members of the administration, so I commend you, and by your positive response, it only encourages the support for these young people that are members of our military, they're teachers, they're workers, they're students. I think they're probably the best economic development program we can have for the nation, with their aggressive innovativeness and their entrepreneurship, their immigrant hunger to succeed and make America move forward. My final question is, according to the news reports from earlier this year, as a result of the administration's anti-immigrant rhetoric and the Department of Homeland Security's over-aggressive enforcement efforts, the Department of Labor officials have noted a marked uptick in workers' reluctance to file complaints against employer, take part in labor investigation, and even accept back wages collected by the department on the workers' behalf. What is the Department of Labor doing to monitor and respond to this situation and reaffirm its commitment to protecting individual information during the course of labor investigation? Will you commit to continuing to ensure that the Department of Labor enforces labor laws regardless of the person's immigration status?
Congressman, that has been a longstanding practice. That has been an issue that has gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it is my intent to continue that practice.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Allen, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here with us today. I was in the construction industry for 35 years before being elected to Congress, and just a point of clarification, if I understood you correctly, on this Silica Rule, is the rule been finalized, or is it still being negotiated, and is it being now implemented, or is it going to be different? I've got people that don't know what, I mean, they're out pricing and getting quotes, and this is very expensive to deal with. And so where are we with this? I mean, are they to comply by this exact rule now? And then what happens if it changes? And like I said, it's very expensive to comply with this thing. Where are we with this?
Congressman, I appreciate the question, and I was smiling because the rule is complicated and has multiple dates, which might be the basis for some of this confusion. Parts of the rule are in effect. Parts do not go into effect for some amount of time. The parties to the litigation, and all sides are represented in this litigation, were, I'm told, close to settlement. Each side has their own set of concerns, and my view is if there's some common ground, we should look for that common ground. We provided a further 30-day extension that has now expired in an effort to get the parties a little bit more time. I was disheartened that rather than use that time, the parties, as often happens, didn't come to the table until right up to the deadline. And so it is my hope that the parties come to the table and come to the table quickly so that we can get this issue resolved.
There's an awful lot of confusion, and like I said, there are people that are being faced with huge cost disadvantages on work that they've already estimated, on contracts they've already signed, and now this rule, they had no way to know what to anticipate. The rule might say, obviously, it is very complicated. Is there any way we can, that OSHA can somehow clarify what's going on and then say, all right, here's where we are, and give the industry some time to adapt to whatever rule we finally come up with, because again, it's very costly. These people are on fixed cost. I mean, they don't put these compliance things in their estimates to complete the work. So all of a sudden, like you said, predictability is critical in the business world out there, and it is critical that these people know where we stand with this.
I understand, Congressman, and we are engaged in efforts to clarify, and we will redouble those efforts because it is important that individuals know what is expected of them.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Mr. DeSaulnier, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for having this hearing. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your testimony and your tenor here today. It's encouraging. I don't know if you've ever attended a funeral of an American worker who's lost their life in a workplace incident. I have. I've represented for 30 years an area of the Bay Area that has amongst the geographic and per capita greatest density of hazardous material facilities, refineries, and chemical plants. Almost 20 years ago, a constituent of mine, Michael Glansman, lost his life because a Fortune 500 company, Tosco, at that time was appealing over 100 citations issued by Cal OSHA just the week before. Two of them, the most concerning that I always remember, that were at the root cause of this incident was that the backup indicators for temperature variations were outside the control room on the unit, Mr. Glanzman this day was unfortunately the junior member. He was sent out to verify that they should shut the unit down, even though it turned out later under inspection that the written policies that instructed them to do that were being overridden by oral instructions. Mr. Glanzman went out, and the second citation that was being appealed was that they should replace the walkie-talkie he was using because it didn't work. We think the last thing he said was shut it down, but we'll never know because he was eviscerated. That explosion not only cost his life, but raised the price of gasoline and diesel on the West Coast by more than 10 cents. A year later, another 4 employees of that facility lost their lives in a gruesome explosion and burned to death. We shut that refinery down in local government for a year and did a full facilities audit. And the result of that audit was very succinct. Corporate culture caused those deaths. So in that context, forgive me for being suspicious. When I see a department that's being cut by $21 million over its last funding of last year, OSHA, $11 million more than the administration asked for, and that you're staffed at a level that's consistent with the 90s, and it would take 159 years for your inspectors to inspect every facility in the United States. So forgive me for being cynical, but you can help me with my skepticism. Last year, on May 12th of 2016, the previous administration had a rulemaking that would instruct employers of over 20 employees in heavy industries like this to electronically notify them when there's illness or workforce injury. Seems like that's what you're after, is efficiency and better results. You have postponed that rulemaking. The website is up and capable of running as of August. We anticipate that over 300,000 reports will be in. We'll be able to track these incidents better, so Mr. Glanzman's of the future will not have what happened to him. So I would like to know if you plan on setting this up and making it work effective December 1st, and if not, why?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Let me just briefly respond. I understand what your point that you're making, and I understand that because we had a similar incident in Miami, and that incident was prosecuted criminally. People died, a boiler blew up, there was a flash steam result, and people died, and it was prosecuted criminally. And so I am very much aware of the importance of vigorous prosecution, particularly, as I said earlier when addressing one of your colleagues, when violations are repeated and when violations are willful. And so, cynical or not, this is something that we take very seriously. With respect to the particular rule that you're addressing, we're looking at that rule. We are balancing the issues of privacy because it was asking for some information that was very detailed and that identified individuals with the needs to get information so that we can engage in appropriate and targeted enforcement. We are moving forward on that, but that does not lessen the seriousness which we will take instances in particular that are repeated and that are willful. And I'm perfectly fine referring them to criminal prosecution. As a matter of fact, in other contexts, I've already made clear to my staff that where appropriate, they should refer things to the U.S. Attorney's Office, that I am more than happy to encourage U.S. Attorney's offices to take our cases, because in addition to civil fines, where you have a culture that is non-compliant and that disregards safety matters, that can be a criminal violation.
Thank you. I appreciate the time the Secretary took to answer the question and did not call time because I thought it was a very serious matter and I wanted to allow the time for that answer, and I appreciate it. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you. Secretary Acosta, good to see you. Thank you for your leadership. We've heard the words skills gap. You used that. It certainly exists. We know that projections are by the year 2020, 6 million jobs that'll go unfilled because of a lack of individuals who are qualified and trained. The tax reform bill that will be on the floor here within the next 24 hours, that's been estimated to create conditions where 1 million additional jobs will grow. That'll all be for nothing, though, if we don't have individuals who are qualified and trained to fill those positions. So I just wanted to get your reflections on it. I worked with many colleagues in this committee, and specifically with Representative Krishnamurthy. We introduced a piece of legislation to strengthen career and technical education for the 21st century, passed out of the House unanimously, and now sits in the Senate. I've really appreciated your support that you've and the administration generally have said about skills-based education, and wanted to just get your, given, that's that many jobs that we need to fill, and it's so important. There's so much opportunity there. Any reflections? Is the legislation we put forward to the Senate, waiting on the Senate, will that be helpful to creating those on-ramps to opportunity for American families?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And let me, I don't have the detail of the legislation in front of me, so let me answer the question generally. I opened by saying I've been traveling to different parts of the country, and I visited the carpenters facility and the pipe fitters and graduation, but I've also visited a community college in Los Angeles. I have visited a community college in Reno. I have visited several community colleges, and to an institution, what I have seen is amazing. Whether it's teaching nursing skills in Pittsburgh, teaching HVAC in Reno, teaching welding in Los Angeles, what community colleges and vocational education centers are doing is not just creating jobs, but changing lives. I had an experience where I met with some young men and women, and the folks that ran the institution were there, but I wanted to really hear from them, so I asked everyone else to leave, and I just talked to the students. And I wanted to do that because they were kids that came from the street that hadn't finished high school and were coming at this late in life. And what they said was that it was transformative because they now had apartments. One was about to get their first car. And so I think taking a step back and recognizing that there is no right path for everyone, and that the question is, what is the right option for an individual, and does it lead to a good job, is critical. And so any measure that does that, subject to all the fiscal issues that we always face as a government, I think is something that should be supported.
Thank you. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krishnamurthy. You're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox, and thank you, Ranking Member Scott, for calling this important hearing, and thank you, Secretary Acosta, for coming. I'm going to piggyback off of my colleague Glenn Thompson's, G.T. Thompson's questions, because I think this is really important. The bill, it's called Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act, is one that Congressman Thompson and I championed, and it passed out of the House unanimously. And so that unfortunately doesn't happen enough with regard to significant pieces of legislation. It's extremely bipartisan. And so I wanted to just get your thoughts about this legislation, whether you and your staff could come back to us with your thoughts about it, because we could definitely enlist your support to get it through the Senate. This is something that employers are clamoring for right now. It's H.R. 2353, just in case you're wondering what the bill number is. Basically, employers, as well as workers, people in my district are clamoring for this bill to be passed. It basically increases transparency. It moves authority for spending a lot of the money from Washington to local community colleges and high school districts. Increases some resources over time for cash-strapped local school districts. And it also requires that if any federal job training dollars are spent, employers have to be at the table so that people aren't trained on skills that are not in demand. So can we get your commitment to take a look at this bill and help us to usher it through the U.S. Senate?
Congressman, you certainly can, and let me just pick up on something that you said that was very important, because in every community college that I have seen, and all of them have been successful, there is an employer partner that is assisting with informing the community college of what the skills are that need to be taught, and that is also very anxious to hire the graduates, and so I think that is critical. Let me also say that one issue of confusion is that there is an Office of Vocational Education at the Department of Education, and we talked about overlaps of workforce education earlier, and one of the large overlaps is we have at the Department of Labor, labor force education, and at the Department of Education, vocational education. And I think the overlap between those two is quite substantial. And so let me say I'm more than happy to return and speak with your staffs. I also think it's important to engage the Department of Education because I'm told that ultimately this is within their jurisdiction.
I understand. The more allies that we can have on this critical piece of legislation that will help our workers and employers, the better. So definitely could use your help. And thank you for committing to us. You're going to help us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rooney, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, first, Mr. Secretary, thank you for changing back the administrator's interpretations on joint employer and the definition of an independent contractor, et cetera, bringing some kind of sanity back to the Labor Department and the workforce. Sure needs it. I'd like to talk about work centers today. Only 6% of workers were represented by unions last year, but the national unions still bring in hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue per year. Comment was made a while ago about corporate culture, something I know about. Well, let's talk about union culture. Maybe dues-paying union members would like to know where their money that's funding these work centers is going. This yet another union boondoggle has been able to operate in a legal-free zone where there's no tracking of their spending. They can have unlimited spending. They're independent organizations, but the black hand of the unions is behind them, and they're not subject to union disclosure. So what I'd like to know is, now that we've got you in there, what can we do to work to define these things under the LMRA as a labor organization and to rein them in and show the people that they're just a front for labor unions?
Congressman, thank you for the question. That question was raised previously at another meeting that I was at, and I'll provide the same answer, which is it's something that we're looking at, and I'm happy to follow up with your office and your staff probably in a few weeks.
Well, I hope you'll move aggressively because the people have been waiting a long time to return some balance to the equilibrium to labor versus corporate entities in this country that provide the jobs. So thank you very much. I yield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rooney. Mr. Scott, are you? I believe. You want us to go ahead? Okay. Mr. Grothman, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. How many employees do you have over there at Department of Labor?
Congressman, I believe we have about 15,000, give or take.
And how many do you get to hire as you try to get a handle of this organization?
Very few, Congressman. I don't have an exact number.
Less than 20? Less than 30?
More than 30, but less than 100, I would say.
Okay. Next question I have. With regard to OSHA, right now there have been some complaints in my district of people who come in, write citations for what we have to say relatively minor things, sometimes sending out public press releases as far as things that may be minor, easily correctable. Do you have any plans to try to do something to kind of rein in OSHA? Are you aware of that problem?
Congressman, as I said earlier, my perspective on OSHA enforcement and enforcement in general is where you have individuals that are trying to do the right thing, that are trying to comply. There is a value to compliance assistance to saying, look, this is how it needs to be done. On the flip side, if you have an employer that is engaged in repeated and willful violations that have resulted in serious harm, we need to be very aggressive in the enforcement. And so I think compliance assistance goes hand in hand with aggressive enforcement.
We talked about the lack of, I think maybe the number one problem for employers in my district is they can't find people to work. And I can think of a couple things we could do about that. For one thing, of course, we still have a large government bureaucracy. Do you feel that you need all of the people who are working for you right now, or are you looking into areas of efficiencies, at least in your little bailiwick? You can maybe decrease the employment and open up some of your folks for work in the private sector.
Well, Congressman, certainly there's always room to improve efficiencies. What we're looking at right now and where we're focused is particularly on the programmatic dollars, because that's by far where most of our spending is, and in how we can spend those dollars wisely to focus on outcomes. As I said earlier, it's not simply, and particularly in the labor education, the workforce education side, not just how many folks are receiving services, but what is the outcome, how many graduates and how many jobs.
Okay. Next question. To a degree, your organization deals with something I'll refer to welfare or help for people. And right now we have a lot of perverse incentives in our society. Could you comment on if you feel you have any role in dealing with our kind of income transfer payments? As President Trump has said he wants to take this up next year, could you give us any role that you might play in this?
Congressman, obviously we will be playing a significant role, particularly when it comes to workforce issues. This is an important factor, and you know, as the President has said, this will be an issue for next year.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Virginia Fox, for your leadership and the bipartisan efforts today with Ranking Member Bobby Scott. Secretary Acosta, we appreciate you and the administration's strong focus on creating jobs by expanding industry-driven apprenticeships and work-based learning. In South Carolina, we have consistently found that the most successful programs are those which are industry-driven, and it is for that reason that Apprenticeship South Carolina is considered a gold standard. We can make strides by starting with high school students having opportunities for training for fulfilling lives. In South Carolina, Boeing, with over 9,000 jobs now in the Charleston area, and with the Apprenticeship Carolina, it has recently kicked off a paid youth apprenticeship program. Students attend high school, take career courses at Trident Technical College. They complete 5 hours per week of job training at Boeing, South Carolina, which produces the world's most advanced wide-body airliner, the 787-10 Dreamliner. Boeing has also partnered with Charleston County District Schools Work-Based Learning Internship Program to bring on high school students as paid interns. These students are working on a special fastener reclamation project and have already reclaimed over $1 million in what would have been wasted fasteners over the first 3 months of the program. What is your view of the Department of Labor's plans to focus on encouraging such industry-driven youth apprenticeships and work-based learning programs in the forthcoming pilot apprenticeship program?
Congressman, thank you for the question, the remarks, and you know, I would observe this is perhaps a second or third set of questions around apprenticeships that raise apprenticeships that are not registered apprenticeships, which goes to my opening comment about how important it is to have a broad view of apprenticeships, to recognize the advantages of registered, but also recognize that there is room for other models, such as the model that you raised. My perspective is, you know, we're a large nation and a diverse nation, and there is room for a variety of programs, and we as a department should encourage workforce education in various forms, so long as there is high quality, so long as there are standards, so long as there is some degree of portability, so that the skills learned in one venue can be ported to different venues. And so long as there is some credential that is earned. And so as we look forward to this apprenticeship task force and how to grow apprenticeship programs, my hope is that we take a broad view of the concept of apprenticeship so we can empower more individuals to have family-sustaining jobs.
And another extraordinary example was MTU of Graniteville, South Carolina, with engine development, working with Aiken Technical College in the district I represent. So thank you for your efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I now recognize the ranking member for 3 minutes and for his closing comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Acosta, for being with us today. As you can tell, there's a lot of interest in the issues under your jurisdiction. The first one, there's bipartisan support for apprenticeship programs so long as we can make sure that the federal dollars are going to quality programs, and that'll take a little work to get that straight. But I think you're aware of the apprentice program at the Nupanu shipyard, which is one of the best in the country. I invite you to visit or at least familiarize yourself, because it's one of the best in the nation. Let me just ask you a couple of questions. The minimum wage hasn't been raised in a long time. Do you have a position on increasing the minimum wage?
Congressman, that is an issue that, that is within Congress's purview. The minimum wage has not been raised in a number of years and is set by Congress.
So you would support an increase in the minimum wage?
I think if that is to happen, Congress should have a discussion, and we're happy to be part of that discussion.
Thank you. On the fiduciary rule, I think you've indicated that the best interest standard is now in effect. However, other parts are not in effect. What would happen when a retiree has best interest violated, is essentially ripped off? What are the remedies?
So Congressman, so long as companies are proceeding in good faith to implement the best interest standard, we are in a compliance assistance mode. But if companies are not proceeding in good faith, we still have enforcement authority. And so if there are willful violations, we do have enforcement authority.
Does the individual have any individual remedy?
Congressman, the enforcement authority within ERISA is a federal enforcement authority and not an individual enforcement authority.
The beryllium rule, as I understand it, you have accepted the lower threshold for exposure, but according to OSHA, 70% of the value of the rule was in the ancillary services and protections. Is that your understanding?
Congressman, I could not speak to the 70% figure. I have not seen that figure, and I believe there might be a disagreement as to whether the ancillary services contribute or do not contribute to the protections.
We'll provide you what we have, because I think that was the accepted from the OSHA department. We've heard a lot about associated health plans. I agree with you, they always work for consumers. The costs are always cheaper for those that can get into an association plan. Everybody else, however, when you take young, healthy people out of the pool, everybody else's costs go up. Is that your understanding about the effect of association plans?
Congressman, what is called in essence cherry picking or anti-cherry picking provisions are an important part of association health plans. That is an issue that we're aware of, and our proposals will be considering that issue and have preventative measures for that issue.
Well, the fact of the matter is, if you get a group, even a random group, if the costs are lower, the association, everybody will join. The costs are higher, everybody will bail and get back into the pool. So they always work for those in the pool. And so I think we have to look at the effect on everyone else, and if that's ignored, then you've missed most of the impact. My time on questions is expired, but I would want to just pose two questions, if you could provide us with some answers. We've heard about the joint employer. There are situations that we have been made aware of where a person can be found to have their overtime benefits violated, their overtime. And when they look up, none of the employers qualify as an employer responsible under the Fair Labor Standards Act. What happens when no one qualifies under that restricted definition of the legislation? If you could provide that for the record. And also, your testimony suggests that jobs will be created by tax reform. If you could give us a research on the job creation impact on upper income tax cuts to low and moderate income individuals, and the comparable spending of the same amount on infrastructure like roads and bridges, or spending on education and job training, not only the jobs that are created to provide the education, but the economic impact of a better educated, better trained workforce. If you could give us the research that you've got on that to justify the idea that this tax bill will create any jobs, that would be helpful. Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity that you provided the committee. And Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the fact that you were here, our first secretary. I forgot to mention we also have jurisdiction over the Department of Agriculture on a few programs, but you're the first, and we look forward to other cabinet secretaries appearing before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I appreciate all of my colleagues today for being so cooperative, and it looks as though, Mr. Secretary, we'll be able to honor your request to be out of here by noon. I have a couple of closing comments. I want to say thank you again. I think you have provided very valuable information to both sides of the aisle here. I particularly appreciate the emphasis you have given on outcomes and accountability. I believe the members appreciate that also. I appreciate the fact that you have talked about skills and education and the fact that there is no right path that leads to a good job or a career. And I particularly appreciate the fact that you do talk about careers. I think we're hearing more and more about that in the conversation about helping people make the right kinds of decisions and helping them understand that their first job is not going to be their last job, and that we want people to have a broader vision of where they're going. I, again, am very encouraged by your talk about performance measures. And I think everybody appreciates your commitment to safety and to creating positive workplaces for workers. Nobody wants any worker to be in an unsafe condition, and I think you are, you've said the right things in that respect, and I believe that you and the department will do the right things. And lastly, I would say that we want to encourage people to think about all education being career education. And the fact that you've pointed out the overlap between the Department of Education and the Department of Labor indicates that we need to be focused more on those issues, that all education, people go to a baccalaureate degree institution, their aim is to get a job. People are participating in apprenticeships because they want to get a good job. They're participating in community colleges because they want to get a job. And so we're all about, at all levels, we're focusing on the same thing. And I think it's useful that we talk about that in the same way and that we don't set up distinctions among the various ways to get the skills to be able to have a successful career. So I appreciate your comments today and your excellent answers, and all of my colleagues who are gone, but to Mr. Scott for playing their roles here today.
Madam Chair.
Yes, sir.
Unanimous consent to enter into the record an article on Delaware companies finding value in autistic workers and a memorandum to the American people from the Department of Labor from the past administration.
Without objection. There being no further business, this committee stands adjourned. My gosh, we couldn't have done that anyway.